Good evening, everyone. Perhaps for some of you, it'll be good afternoon, and for others, it might even be good morning. Welcome to Massachusetts Peace Action, another one of our webinars in our webinar series. Tonight, we're going to be talking about Iraq, occupation, governance, and protests. My name is Val Moghadam. I'm a member of Massachusetts Peace Action. I'm on the board of directors of Peace Action, a member of its Middle East working group, and I'm also professor of sociology and international affairs at Northeastern University here in Boston. We've only got an hour for our webinar, so let me just very quickly introduce the webinar, and then I'll introduce our guests as well. The 2003 invasion and occupation of Iraq by US and British forces was a momentous event for Iraq, the region, and the world. Since then, Iraq has experienced political instability, corruption, deteriorating public services, economic decline, ISIS terrorism, and several protest waves. A new government was formed just this past May, but protests have continued, and the country now faces health, environmental, and security threats. Tonight's webinar will examine the structural and institutional defects that have generated such citizen frustration and protest, as well as civil society initiatives. So I'm delighted to say that our speakers tonight are political scientist Shamiran Mako and documentary filmmaker Terry Kay Rockefeller, and I will proceed to introduce each of them. Shamiran Mako is assistant professor of international relations at Boston University's Pardee School of Global Studies. Born in Iraq, she is co-editor of a book on Iraq, and she's also working on another book tracing the institutional legacies of ethnic conflict in Iraq, with a focus on how modes of inclusion and exclusion have faced the mobilization strategies of the different communal groups. She's also the co-author with me of a forthcoming book published soon by Cambridge, explaining the divergent outcomes of the Arab Spring Uprisings in 7 countries in the region. Shamiran will be talking about Iraq's political and institutional setup since 2003 and the challenges of its complex power sharing arrangement. She'll also talk about Iraq's regional and international relations and US economic and military interests in the country. Shamiran has kindly prepared a PowerPoint to guide some of the discussion. Terry Kay Rockefeller is a documentary filmmaker who worked on Eyes on the Prize, that famous documentary on the history of the American civil rights and Black power movements. She also has worked on the Nova Science series and other productions for public television. Terry's sister, Laura Rockefeller, was killed in the 9/11 terrorist attack on the World Trade Center. And since 2002, Terry has worked with a group called the September 11th Families for Peaceful Tomorrows to honor her sister's life and to ensure peaceful futures. Following the US-led invasion of Iraq, Terry, along with Peaceful Tomorrows, began seeking ways to remain supportive of the Iraqi people. And today, Terry works with the Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative, which is a collaboration between Iraqi and international NGOs to support human rights, democracy, and anti-corruption activists in Iraq. And she'll be telling us more about that group. She'll speak about the protest movements in Iraq from 2011 to the present, the protests that started in October 2019, and also how COVID-19 has been influencing the protests. She'll tell us about major initiatives of civil society in Iraq today, including accountability for human rights violations of protesters, about women's rights, and initiatives around environmental issues. That includes, for example, recent civil society efforts to build regional solidarity around water issues, which will be very interesting to hear about. And she'll be emphasizing the need and potential for international solidarity with Iraqi and Iraqi civil society. Terry also has kindly prepared a PowerPoint to guide the discussion. I've asked Shamiran and Terry to speak for 10 to 15 minutes, after which I may pose some follow-up questions, and then we can take any of your own questions and comments. Please use, there is a Q&A function, which you can see at the bottom of your screen, and please use that to pose any questions or comments, or to let us know that you would wish to do so. So without further ado, I give the virtual floor to Shamiran Mako. Thank you for your attention and for being here.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much, Val, and thanks, Terry. Can everyone hear me fine? Yeah, okay, great. So when Val asked me to speak on this panel, I, of course, accepted with delight, and it's obviously a topic that's very close to me because I was born in Iraq, but also it's a country I work on extensively. And so what I'm going to talk about today is just, probably take about 10 minutes because I'd love to get into the Q&A and focus kind of broadly on what happened in Iraq, what were some of the motivations behind the invasion, and what the institutional setup that was chosen for the country was, what it was modeled after, and what the hopes were that that institutional setting would actually bring about in shaping the kind of emerging democracy that the neoconservatives who had planned the Iraq War of 2003 had hoped to kind of fashion in the region. And so I'll go through my PowerPoint very quickly. I promise it has very little words, and it's a lot of kind of graphs and kind of basic descriptive data on the country and some of the issues that matter to Iraqis as a whole. And so let me see if this actually works. Can everyone see that? Yes, okay.
Yes.
So, so the 2003 invasion was an outcome really of what was happening in the 1990s, especially before even in the Gulf War, but really a little bit before the Gulf War, but definitely in the lead up to the Gulf War of 1990, post-Gulf War, and when the sanctions regime was put in place. Throughout the mid-1990s and the late 1990s, there was this push under the Clinton administration, a push by neoconservatives, but also some Democrats on the Clinton administration, that the Ba'ath regime in Iraq, and specifically Saddam Hussein, had become unstable, and that really we're looking more towards regime change rather than actually affecting some sort of a democratic process internally and organically within the country itself. And so come 1998, Clinton signs the Iraq Liberation Act after the lobbying of different neoconservative groups to advocate for regime change in Iraq, forcible regime change and external regime change in Iraq. And of course, come 9/11, the kind of the precedent and the path had already been set in the way in which the Bush administration had wanted to build on what had happened under the Clinton administration in pushing for regime change in the country. So for those of you who may not know, I'll just kind of quickly say it. The reason for the Iraq invasion of 2003 was that one, Saddam Hussein had links to Al-Qaeda and different Sunni Islamist terrorist organizations that had been, part of the planning of 9/11, and that Saddam and Iraq were capable of producing weapons of mass destruction. And when both of the first two items were not only based on faulty intelligence, but proved to be really unsubstantiated to a large extent, then there was a push towards regime change for democracy promotion. And so you have this kind of, especially the third part becomes instrumental in the way the actual institutional setup of the country had been put in place in 2002 and the lead up to the war in 2003 and the invasion. And so what you have is essentially part of this 1990s and the early 2000s movement is neoconservatives and different members of the intelligence community working in conjunction with a good amount of Iraqi expats, primarily Shia expats, people like Ahmed al-Chalabi, most notably, but also some Sunni expats, and of course the Kurdish leadership in the northern Iraq. in advocating for this regime change that was going to take place in 2003. And so what you have come 2003 is really obviously an invasion and then an occupation that lasts about a year. And Paul Bremer takes, he's at the helm of devising this kind of new institutional setup. And the idea behind it in many ways, as advocated by these different Iraqi expats, was that the Ba'athist regime had a deep control over the state and its institutions. And so the state really needed to be dismantled in almost in its entirety. And so the financial sectors of the state, the economic sectors, development sectors, political sectors, the armed forces, all of these things were kind of stripped apart. Some pieces were kept together, but you largely have this kind of complete overhaul of the state starting from scratch. And the system that was put in place, the kind of ethnic coalition building type of constitutional model, was that it would be based on a kind of a grand coalition where different political parties, largely based on ethnic and sectarian lines, would form government. And throughout, every 4 years, you would have elections. But the idea behind it was that you would have a consociational model that would allow ethnic power sharing amongst Iraq's 3 dominant groups, the Shias, who are the majority, the Kurds, who are a substantial minority, about 20% of the population, and of course the Sunni Arabs, who are about another 20% of the population. And then you have more or less quota systems that are put in place for minorities, including the Assyrians, the Yazidis, the Turkmens, and so on. And so, but what you have is, again, this kind of a weak constitutional model and a weak institutional model that ultimately what we've seen over the past 18 years cement power sharing at this kind of grand coalition level, but very little incentives in terms of power sharing at the kind of more devolved provincial levels or municipal levels amongst different Iraqi elites. And so what you ultimately have, what we call the muhassasa system, where really governance at the federal level, at the provincial level, and at the municipal level is captured by the different ethnic elites that are tied to much larger ethnic political parties. And you have a system that's kind of trapped in this ethnic capturing model, where most notably the Shias are the Shia blocs are the kind of dominant winners of these grand coalitions. And you have the Kurds and the Sunnis, and of course different minorities that are kind of loosely affiliated with the system, but are really more or less powerless. And so what this does is essentially, it kind of traps Iraq's ability to form public policy that's based on a technocratic basis and not strictly on a kind of an ethnic reward system that we've seen that's been applied over the past 18 years or so. And so when we look at governance indicators, right, as a kind of a snapshot view of where Iraq stands, and looking at 2002 before regime change, and then in 2018, the y-axis to the left is actually scaled, so you can think these indicators are out of 100. So you can think of, Norway that would, I'm purposely not saying the United States because it doesn't score up to 100, but you can think of like Norway, Finland, Scandinavian countries that come up on top. They rank in almost near the 100th percentile in these governance indicators. And of course, the lower the score, the worse that country ranks on these indicators. And so we're looking at voice and accountability, political stability in the absence of violence, government effectiveness, regulatory quality. So this actually looks at how public policy is shaped and how it's implemented, and how different institutions function to actually provide public services. Rule of law, most notably, and one of the most important kind of indicators when we look at the healthfulness of a country's political ranking, and of course, control for corruption. Now, on some of these indicators, you see a bit of improvement, although again, considering that the y-axis is scaled, you really don't go up past, on any of the indicators, you don't see a rise, kind of a skyrocketing of anything close to 25, a 25 point ranking. And so you have a little bit of improvement when we look at voice and accountability, because you do have elections that are being held regularly. But on all other indicators, you kind of have this uptick a little bit. And on other indicators, you actually have a downward slope and a downward trend, especially when we look at political stability and the absence of violence, which has been key to shaping questions of migration, forced migration in the country, but also kind of just an overall security dilemma that many Iraqis face that actually trickles down from the political level to the economic level and the development level. And so you have very little improvement, is what I'm trying to say overall, and looking at this kind of 16-year trajectory in Iraq's governing capacity before regime change and then after regime change. And on some indicators, it actually fares worse. And so what does all of this mean when we actually look at how Iraqis feel about the system itself, which I think is the most important part in gauging whether or not, America's democracy promotion in the country has worked, or that's, it's actually potentially brought up some sort of a stabilizing democracy in the region. Now, this is largely based on the Arab Barometer. They do fantastic surveys, which give us, again, a kind of a snapshot view of where, particular countries in the Middle East and North Africa stand on key political, economic, and development, social development issues. And so to the right here, the question is, what is the most important challenge facing your country now? And overwhelmingly, Iraqis note corruption, and the healthfulness of the economy. And so when we cluster both of those together and we look at the data on a more kind of granular level, what we see is that there's a high priority that's placed on the absence of upward mobility. And there's a high priority that's placed on youth unemployment and youth underemployment. And Iraq, just like the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, has this kind of, we talk about a youth bulge, a high youth population that tends to cluster around the middle, which is the, a substantial portion of the actual demographic makeup of the country. And so there's a lot of questions of powerlessness that goes with, questions of corruption and the absence of economic development. And both of these things actually tie to the political system that was put in place post 2003, where you have this ethnic elite capture of both the state institutions, but also ethnic elite capture of the actual allocation of resources of the state. Now, around 90% of Iraq's budget, operating budget, comes from the sale of oil. So it is a rentier economy, but it's a rentier economy that's heavily controlled by these ethnic power blocks in terms of how resources are actually distributed. And this goes to the federal level, but also to the regional level when we look at the Kurdistan region of Iraq. Now, when we look at perceptions of corruption and compare where Iraq stands to the rest of the Middle East and North Africa, it comes in second, right? Second next to Libya, which is quite substantial. It's on par with Tunisia. And so you have, the question of corruption and the way that that feeds into the political system that was set up and the kind of economic disenfranchisement that's tied to that political system, they really kind of go hand in hand. Now, interestingly, the way that people's distrust of the political institutions that were put in place, which actually feeds into what Terry will be talking about in terms of what's fueling these mass protest movements that are largely youth-led and they're cross-sectoral, is over time, you see this kind of declining slope in both the way people see the importance of democracy, but also in the way that the government, a distrust in the way the government's actually tackling corruption. And so trends and perceived extent to which the national government is working to crack down on corruption amongst Iraqis. In 2011, it's at about 20%. In 2013, there's a bit of an uptick as different coalitions kind of work towards finding a solution just before ISIL took over. And then by 2018, that really dips to about 22%. So again, there's very little trust in the government in its ability to actually do its job and provide economic stability and political stability. Now, the graph to the left, the question is, which is more important in causing the lack of development in the Arab world? And this is a really important question because when we look at the kind of granular data, you get really, really interesting trends. Before about 2011, there's a lot of emphasis on, Iraq's woes were largely tied to the occupation and the invasion and the kind of regional forces that were fomenting, sectarian narratives inside of the country that was fueling a lot of the political violence in the country. But we see a shift most recently with the latest Arab Barometer wave, we see a shift where Iraqis are actually looking a lot more inwardly and placing the blame on the political system that was put in place that has actually enabled this kind of ethnic capturing model by these, powerful ruling elites that have both hijacked the political system and also the economic system. And as Terry will be talking about, much of the narratives that we're seeing coming out of the protest movements in Iraq since 2018 have really emphasized this kind of internal looking, inward looking, and a lot of blame that's been placed on politicians in manipulating, the economic system and the political system to their own advantage. And what we see at the same time is this kind of decline, a slope in trends in political interests. And so over time, we see, more Iraqis saying they're becoming less and less interested in the political system and what happens kind of nationally with politics, more disinterest in voting, for example, and in following, politicians and what these grand coalitions are aiming to do when elections do come up. And definitely more disinterest among Iraqi youth in politics. And so this is, again, something that's been echoed in the protest movements that have been happening throughout the country. And so when we look at, a kind of other trends in the way opinion actually reflects the faulty institutional setup that was put in place in 2003, is you see this kind of, again, a digression in people's perception, of Iraqis' perception of democracy and the way that a democracy is actually capable of tackling, economic and political pressures and tackling corruption. And so, for example, the top left there, it says in democratic systems, the economic performance is weak. And about 51% of Iraqis in 2018 agreed to this question, right? That in democracies, you really don't have positive economic output. Right. And of course, to the top right, you see democratic regimes are ineffective in maintaining order and stability. And again, you have this kind of skyrocketing in public opinion amongst the Iraqis in agreeing, that democracies may not necessarily function at the best that they can. And a lot of it, again, harks back on this muhassasa system, this grand coalition, ethnic coalition, where the distribution and the kind of spoils of the state are distributed amongst these different powerful ethnic elite blocks that really hijack the system. And so overall, we see these kind of, downward economic trends, but also downward political trends in terms of attitudes towards the system that was put in place. And I know Val had asked me to speak a little bit about what all of this means and why Iraq is important and why we should pay attention. Besides the fact that the Iraq war has cost the American taxpayer about $2.7 trillion, the Cost of War project does a fantastic job at actually aggregating, but also disaggregating where the cost of war comes from and the kind of future projections that we see and why these wars matter and why these type of, forced democracy promotion incentives or initiatives produce really, really weak democracies at best. When we look at Iraq and its kind of position in the MENA region, it's obviously a strategic country for many reasons. It's the fourth largest oil producer in the world, or fourth largest country with the fourth largest oil reserves in the world. But you also have a country that's kind of nestled between two regional power blocks, right? Iran to the east and Saudi Arabia to the west, which has always meant that Iraq's politics since the Iranian Revolution in 1979 has more or less been bound by this kind of regional, larger regional international relations that involve these two great kind of power countries in the region. But it's also an important country because not only is it a major oil producer, but a hub of its oil production, is tied to what happens in the Gulf region. And specifically the Strait of Hormuz. And the Strait of Hormuz is responsible for about 17% of the daily flow of oil out of the region, which is the largest, I think the world's largest oil choke point, if I'm not mistaken. And so I'll leave the rest of the the rest of the questions of institutional setup and its failure to the Q&A. But I just want to close with this, which I think is interesting because it reflects this incoherent foreign policy blunder that America went on, in 2003 and discounting Afghanistan, because that's not the kind of focus of what we're talking about today, but that's another important country to look at. But this came out in 2015. It was a headline, I think, from Bloomberg that said Donald Rumsfeld, George Bush was wrong about Iraq. And in the article from 2015 at the bottom, it says Bush was wrong on Iraq, and that the idea that we could fashion a democracy in Iraq seemed to me unrealistic. I was concerned about it when I first heard those words. I am not one who thinks that our particular template of democracy is appropriate for other countries at every moment of their histories. Interestingly enough, 12 years before that, in 2003, as we know, Rumsfeld was instrumental in fashioning, much of the post-2003 transition in Iraq. And in 2003, he's quoted as saying, this much is clear. We have a stake in their success. For if Iraq, with its size, capabilities, resources, and its history, is able to move to the path of representative democracy, however bumpy the road, then the impact in the region and around the world could be dramatic. Iraq could conceivably become a model, proof that a moderate Muslim state can succeed in the battle against extremism taking place in the Muslim world today. And really, this kind of incoherence in American foreign policy, post-Cold War, but especially of the 2000s and post 9/11, reflects much of the failures that Iraq and Afghanistan obviously have experienced. And what we're seeing is kind of an outcome of that, of very quick interventions, very quick wars, and very little in terms of output.
Yeah.
So I'll stop there.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. I mean, the hypocrisy and the chutzpah, shall I say, are really just amazing on the part of these politicos. I mean, has there ever been an example of American intervention that has actually produced something good? I would say no. At this point, there are a couple of questions for you, Shamiran, but we'll come back to them after Terry has spoken too. So Terry Rockefeller will now be speaking about the civil society side of things in Iraq. So please, Terry.
Thanks, Val. Thanks, Shamiran. And thanks everyone for being here tonight. So after the 9/11 attacks and when Peaceful Tomorrows was organized, what we felt was a really critical part of our mission was to identify with civilian victims of terrorism, war, and political violence around the world. And Iraq has a long and illustrious history of having a strong civil society, but clearly the dictatorship of Saddam Hussein and the early years of American occupation had been a major rupture in their civil society. But even amidst our occupation of the country, there were really positive efforts to revive an active civil society. And Peaceful Tomorrows in 2007 connected with an organization called La Umph, which means in Arabic, no violence. And they had organized around an understanding of the triple evils of violence, sectarianism, and corruption, which they saw all interacting and all having been totally exacerbated by the policies that the United States had put into place during the occupation and the form of government that you've just heard described by Shamiran. The members of La Umph tried to be a model of the future civil society that they hoped would exist. They elected representatives by the governorates of steering committees. They insisted that the chair or the co-chair of each steering committee be a male and a female. They insisted that the steering committee reflect the ethnic diversity of the governorate. And in 2007, and then again in 2009. In 2007, the leaders of La Umph came together in ERBIL, and I was able to be present. And then in 2009, they organized a conference in the northern part of ERBIL governorate at a retreat. And they had over 250 people who were able to be there despite the fact that the occupation was still ongoing. And it was fascinating just to be with these people, to listen to their stories of the suffering they'd endured. But I also remember so clearly that they were inspired by two ideas. One was that they wanted to organize a marathon in Baghdad, an international marathon, in order to show that the people were going to take back the streets and that people could come to Baghdad and be safe. And the second thing that happened at that conference was we watched a beautiful documentary film about the Iraqi marshes. And there was just this passion in the room from people from all parts of the country who felt that the Iraqi marshes was a symbol that unified them, or was a place, something that unified them. The marshes are where the Sumerians existed, where writing was created, and they're just an astoundingly beautiful place. So in that same year, and I'm now going to start sharing my screen, and if you can just confirm that this is working.
Not quite yet. Ah, yes.
But I want to be. Okay. In that same year, some of the European progressive NGOs were able to put together money to have a conference in Rome. And they invited 75 leaders of Iraqi civil society. In the end, about, I think, 52 of them were able to get the visas to get out of there, to get to Rome, get out of Iraq and get to Rome. And there were about 30 of us representing NGOs from the UK, from Italy, Spain, and the US. And the way the conference was structured was that for the first 3 days, it was Iraqis only talking to one another. And then on the fourth and fifth day, we were invited in as members of international civil society to listen to what the Iraqis felt their concerns were. I'm not going to read the list to you. I'll be talking to you. You can read, understand them. And then on the last 2 days of the conference, we talked about how we would support the Iraqis in what they had presented to us and what they wanted to achieve. And we came out with, was just the words on the screen about the problems they were addressing and the hopes they had that Iraqi civil society really would play a role in determining the future of their country, come from the final statement. But we came away with it with a commitment that the top priority they felt was that Iraq had to pass an NGO law that made independent civil society organizations a reality. And that took about 2 years, but in the end, Iraq did end up with a decent civil society NGO law, a law that allows there to be organizations that are separate from the political party, that allows them to preserve their privacy and to take actions. We had a second meeting of the Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative in 2010. This should say, I'm sorry, it's a typo, it should say 2011. In 2010 in Paris. And then finally in 2011, we met in ERBIL, and we broke up into, it was 3 days of conferencing. We broke up into groups that were really issue-oriented: labor, women's rights, student protests, students' rights, freedom of the press. And we had a marathon in ERBIL, and it ended up in, the finish line was in a park in ERBIL that actually is a converted military base, which was kind of just a really lovely bonus. I still remember all the people in the streets, just cheering, "These streets are ours, these streets are ours." 2013 was really a landmark year for civil society. The Iraqi Social Forum was launched as a partner of the World Social Forum. And with over 3,000 participants, it was the largest national social forum ever organized in the Arab world. It was held, this in the lower corner is Al-Mutnabi Street in downtown Baghdad, and we were right off of, in a meeting room, right off of I'm getting tongue-tied. Al-Mutnabi Street, which is the street of the booksellers, and it's really considered the heart of intellectual Baghdad. So it was a wonderful occasion. There was a huge participation of youth in the conference. Many of them served as translators for the internationals who were there, who didn't speak Arabic. But all the workshops were multi-generational, which was really a wonderful thing. By 2016, between the Iraqi Civil Society Solidarity Initiative and the Iraqi Social Forum, there were a number of issues that people had kind of settled on as the work that needed to be done, now that they were trying to reclaim their role as real participants in building the Iraqi culture and society. And out of these, what I'm going to do in the next short period of time is just focus briefly on 3 of the campaigns to give you an idea of what's been done. But I'm happy to answer questions about other pieces as well, other pieces of civil society work. Sports Against Violence was the campaign that was finally agreed upon as a response to this desire to have a Baghdad marathon. And from the very beginning, Sports Against Violence has been able to say that we're going out and doing sporting activities because we see the need for freedom and democracy, because we want to build friendship, because we want to have people understand their rights and responsibilities, and because we want to make this a country that's peaceful again. And so successfully, finally, I'm trying to check my year here, in 2015, the first Baghdad marathon was run, and it was huge. And it was a really joyous event for everyone who had been working so hard to pull it off. And since then, there's been a marathon every year. And this Sports Against Violence model of organizing has now been developed into, we do sports organizing because we want to promote women's rights, which you'll see on the top corner. We do sports organizing, and this is a football tournament that was held in a refugee camp in Kurdistan. We do sports organizing because we need to understand what internally displaced and refugee people are experiencing. And in the bottom corner is sports organizing. They've taken this model out of Baghdad. Obviously, it's been in Kurdistan, but they've taken it to local social forums, and they find that the sports activities is a way to draw in youth and then get youth involved in the issues that they're working on. Save the Tigris River and the Iraqi Marshes was the second really major campaign launched, and truly one of the most, I think, awe-inspiring and successful. The Iraqi Marshes are just this magical place. As I said, it was, where the Sumerians first developed writing. It's an ecosystem that depends upon the reeds that grow in the marshes, the water buffalo that are there, and the fish and the birds that live on the water. And the marsh Arabs, whose culture is hundreds of years old, use all these materials naturally. And I mean, they live in harmony with this place. Excuse me while I drink a bit of water. The first thing the campaign did is that they won UNESCO World Heritage Site recognition for the marshes, which grants, you know, them rights to demand certain protections. They got it as a cultural heritage site and also as a natural heritage site because of the extraordinary wildlife that's there. But tragically, Iraq has not been effective at actually protecting and even fighting for defending the water rights it should have. And both Turkey and Iraq have built huge dams upstream that have really threatened the marshes. And so the next thing that happened in the campaign is that they developed a partnership with the people who were fighting a big dam at Hasankeyf, which is in Turkey. Hasankeyf was the site of settlement for continuous settlement for more than 11,000 years. It is, you see it here, partially flooded. It has since been tragically destroyed, but the partnerships that people began to build as they fought for their common interests have now led to something that's called the Mesopotamian Water Forum, which is truly regional. They are taking on more challenges to water, pollution, and climate change, which is a major source of water shortages in the region. And this past May, they actually had their first, they had this virtual assembly, like all of us doing everything virtual, and they had Iranians, Syrians, Turks, and Iraqis speaking together to one another. And their slogan is, you know, water must be a tool for peace, not for conflict. The She Revolution is one of many projects that have been done on women's rights. This particular is our newest campaign. It grows out of the role that the women were playing in the protests. The issues they were taking on were violence against women and domestic abuse, working for a domestic abuse law, and also working to ensure that women played a greater role in peacekeeping and conflict settlement, post-conflict settlement. It's brand new. It's attracting just many very young women, and I think it has an exciting future. I'm going to wrap up with some talk about the protests, and I realize we're running short on time, but let me just say that when the world was focused on Egypt and Tunisia, Iraq was having its own Arab Spring. What they were saying at the time was, we are not moving to overthrow our government as they've done in Iraq. We want to reform our government. We want to solve these problems in governance that Shamiran was describing for us. Then the protests spread beyond Baghdad in subsequent years. This was in 2015 when Basra really rose up because of problems with water and electricity shortages. And then in Sulaymaniyah, where the Iraqi Kurdistan government was failing to pay teachers' salaries and workers' salaries. By 2016, the protests were really focused on upcoming elections, and they were calling for a civil democratic state, by which they meant a state that was not structured around sectarianism, governance that was not structured around sectarianism, and a government where people were elected because of their capacity and expertise for the jobs they were doing, or appointed because of their expertise. By October of 2019, it was very clear that those demands those protests had not received the attention and had not been delivered. And this amazing youth-led protest was launched. They very quickly called it the October Revolution. Within weeks, the protests were massive. This young man you see, is looking down on Tahrir Square in Baghdad, and it's wall-to-wall people. They had hundreds of thousands of people there. In the bottom corner are representatives of the teachers union. The teachers union actually turned out in the protests. They supported the university students who were out of school. Within weeks, there were protests in all the governorates, and it just, you know, it just clearly, it was a moment that was meant to happen. Also, within a very short time, the repression was quite violent. There were, the repression was being carried out by multiple parties, by police, by security forces, by militias that were tied to specific political parties, and also by vigilantes. There were snipers on rooftops. There was use of military-grade tear gas canisters, which were fired directly into the crowds and killed people. By January, the official estimate was that 500 Iraqis had been killed. Even some of the officials knew that that was an underestimate. By now, the protesters are saying there's certainly over 1,000 people killed. People were also falsely arrested, tortured, and disappeared. But interestingly, the protesters really, I think, almost were galvanized by this violent crackdown. These people are wearing masks, not because of COVID, but because of the tear gas. And they then organized a marathon where they wore masks to protest. And then everyone turned out in Tahrir Square wearing masks to protest the use of the tear gas. And as the weeks and months went by, there was just an astounding community that grew up. On the top corner is the Turkish restaurant, which was taken over and turned into a cultural center with a free room for women to go and discuss women's issues and have safety. In the bottom, you see people just, you know, spending the entire day and night in Tahrir Square. When they imposed a curfew on the protesters and said they had to leave the square by 10 o'clock, they went and pitched tents in the square and moved into the tents to say that, that, you know, they were home. They were respecting the protest, the curfew. Ultimately, the COVID epidemic has shut the protests down. People are doing what we're doing. They're continuing their discussions on Zoom. Yeah. They do turn out in smaller numbers, but you know, I'm not a fortune teller. I can't predict exactly, you know, what will happen, but I'm looking forward to discussing the protests and everything else with you.
That's great. Thank you so much, Terry, for that wonderful survey of civil society initiatives and the kind of movements that you know, a lot of us never knew about. You know, I have a bunch of questions, but I've noticed that we're running short of time, and I noticed that we have at least 4 questions to be posed. Let me read one of the questions. Shamiran, this is for you, and then I might just pose my own question for both of you, but I think specifically for Terry. And this is a question from Nermeen Alam. Hello, Nermeen. And she writes, Shamiran, this is such an excellent analysis. Thank you so much for your presentation. My question is, how do we understand the present trajectories in light of these historical legacies? How the political and institutional setup since 2003 may influence the success or failure of the current wave of protests and contentions in Iraq. So that touches nicely on both presentations.
Okay, can you all hear me? Okay, Nermeen, good to see you, or not see you, but thanks for your question. So it's really important because much of what we see post 2003 is actually an outcome of prior historical legacies with governance. And so much of what the, expat elites had envisioned for post-2003 Iraq was based on, Shia and Kurdish exclusion from the state from the time of its founding until 2003. And so the historical legacies actually matter, because not only do they shape how different Iraqi elites came to envision what would happen post-2003, but in the way they actually then captured the state and then more or less repeated actually similar patterns of exclusion in the way they targeted the Sunni community in Iraq.
Can I just ask a question? Because, I think that the question that I have as well is, but it looks like, from what Terry was saying too, that the protests seem to be transcending these communal and sectarian divides. Is that the case? And if not, then, can you explain that?
They're absolutely trying to transcend the, these historical legacies, both before 2003 and post 2003. And I have to say, even before 2003, you had, civil society organizations, political parties. The Iraqi Communist Party was incredibly diverse. It was brought to Iraq by an Assyrian Christian, and then it became a dominant force amongst the Shias and amongst the Kurdish factions, different Kurdish factions by the late 1950s, 1960s, etc. So on a societal level, you've had, cross-sectoral efforts against the Ba'ath regime. You've had cross-sectoral efforts in different civil society organizations and political parties. And we actually see that post-2003, as Terry has really nicely, surveyed. The call is to kind of dismantle the system, right? The system that cements these real hierarchical notions of what community gets to control what part of Iraq. And the kind of the spoils of the country's resources. But institutions are sticky, right? They're hard to change. And these legacies matter in the way people think about where they are and how they fit in the emergent state. We think about a lot of these kind of legacies in all of Iraq, but there are very similar legacies even in Iraqi Kurdistan, right? There are real challenges to the kind of oligarchical power of these two ruling families that control Kurdish politics in the north, and that's the Barzanis and the Talabanis. And so, and we often think about the north as being a bit more democratic and more open, and actually when we compare the political indicators of what's happening in the north with the rest of the country, it's not. And so the legacies are there, they're sticky, the institutions are really hard to change. But going back to Nermeen's question, I think looking to revamp some sections of the Constitution is important, actually defining what the regions are, defining clearly, and I think this is going to be a challenge for Iraq's political elite, is actually defining what, who controls what in terms of oil production, allocation of oil resources, and even on an electoral level, there's a lot of power sharing that happens, or power sharing happens at the top amongst these grand coalitions, especially within intra-political party coalitions, so amongst the Shias, amongst the Kurds, and amongst the Sunnis, but that power sharing doesn't trickle down at all. And so there has to be some change on an institutional level to allow power sharing to trickle down to the municipalities, to local policing, right? And things like that. And so, and of course, inclusion of minority voices. What we've seen, one of the devastating effects of ISIL's campaign, and really it actually even started before 2014, is that you've seen more or less the decimation of Iraqi minorities, the Yazidis, the Assyrians who were targeted, and the Turkmens to an extent that were targeted by ISIL. So there has to be a lot that needs, that's got to change, and that's a challenge for the current government. Is it willing to kind of look more holistically at these institutions, create different task forces to change these institutions? Or is the system going to win? And that's the ultimate question, right? And I think only time will tell.
Yeah, there is another question actually about how Iraqis might do this balancing act between the US and Iran. And so I think that also brings us back to some of the factional politics that are in place and that are also a legacy of the 2003 disastrous American invasion. So that also leads to the question of these different political factions. How do they feel about the continued American presence there? And also civil society. How do these different civil society groups feel about these threats that Trump has been making recently, the assassination of General Soleimani and the Iraqi commander Mohandis. How are people feeling about what America did and continues to do to Iraq on the control of assets and so on? So the political factions, USA, Iran, and civil society feelings about the United States.
Yeah, you know, I think that all these issues are at the center of the protests. I mean, the protests are about having an independent Iraq. The protests are very much, from 2015 on, they were very much focused on ending US and Iranian manipulation of the system through the sectarian political parties, and about not having Iraq be in the middle of the US-Iranian conflict and all that it was doing to the region. So, you know, I think the protesters and the civil society activists are very much focused on that issue. The other issue that I hear them talking about all the time in terms of governance is we want people in the ministries who are experts in the work they're doing. We don't want them assigned because defense has to go to one ethnic group and the Department of the Interior has to go to another. And, you know, that's not logic. I mean, that's not the way to get good good policy. I would point to something I wasn't talking about, but I would point to what has probably been the most successful civil society group in terms of being able to advocate for themselves with the government, which is organized labor. And they do it because they have tremendous support from the International Labor Organization.
And the probably the International Trade Union Confederation as well. Okay, Shamiran, do you want to say something about these political factions and how that's playing out, especially in light of what's been going on this year? You know, a question that I wanted to pose to you about your bar chart about the perceptions of internal versus external sources of the problems. When was that? When was the survey, the Arab Barometer survey, conducted in Iraq? Because, you know, in 2020 things changed a great deal with the assassinations, and then with the parliamentary vote, and then Trump's you know, threats of sanctions and so on and so forth.
Yeah, I think it's the fifth wave, so it's the most recent wave, and I want to say it was 2019, which means the survey was probably done, you know, like late 2018 or 2018, early 2019. In terms of, and I think Terry, you know, put it really nicely, we're seeing on a society, and there's a fissure here, right? And the way we have to analyze Iraqi politics is in the same way that we have to disaggregate American politics, right? And the way we look at what the administration is doing, for example, versus these cross-sectoral mass mobilization movements that we're seeing through Black Lives Matter, right? There's a kind of disconnect, and that same societal versus kind of ruling, you know, governing disconnect that we're seeing here, we should use that to also think about the way that's shaping Iraqi politics when it comes to questions of Iranian influence, when it comes to questions of you know, other regional influences, including Saudi Arabia, Qatar, which were instrumental, especially Qatar and Al Jazeera, were instrumental in post-2003 in fueling some of these sectarian narratives that we had started to kind of see emerging in the country by 2005, 2006. And so the external forces are plentiful. And what we've seen happening in Iraq since 2003 is that it's really become a playing field in the same way that it became a playing field in the Iran-Iraq war of the 1980s. So in many ways, what we're seeing, this Iranian rivalry, right? Iran on the one hand, Iraq on the, you know, in the middle, and then the different Sunni Gulf forces, you know, on the other, it's in some ways it's not new, and it's been there since 1979. It's actually one of the kind of forces that ignites the Iran-Iraq war. The difference is that the Gulf states supported the, Saddam Hussein regime against Iran in the Gulf War, or in the Iran-Iraq War. What we see post-2003, because of the change of the ruling elite, where you have a majority, Shias who have captured the state, the Gulf states then kind of turn against the ruling elites, and then you have this kind of, battleground that happens in the heart of the Middle East for who gets to control what. In terms of the balancing act, and I think this is going to be, I'm kind of hopeful in what's going to happen with the, the Qadami government, in thinking about integrating some of the militias that can be integrated, and completely dismantling some of the militias that have to be dismantled. And again, because the government is new, because the government was just formed as of last May, and there was a stalemate, 3 times there was efforts for 3 prime ministers tried to form government and they failed, and they couldn't. Given how complex these kind of the political system has become, in the ways that it's been so entrenched in the amongst different ethnic elites who have captured the state. And so it's going to be a question of how many of these militias get to become integrated in the state. How will the state then completely demobilize and disarm the militias that can be integrated? And I think in terms of, we think about Iraq balancing against Iran or balancing against Saudi Arabia, Iraq also has to kind of balance against external forces that are outside the region, right? Turkey constantly bombards northern Iraq. And it's actually leading to, an internally displaced population amongst the populations that live in the northern borders. And at the same time, you have the US that's more or less set up shop, and it's fighting its own wars right out of the country. And so the balancing act is not just from one direction, right? It's multiple. And that's going to be a real challenge. And I don't know what's going to happen there, and it's going to be even more, it's become even more unpredictable with the Trump administration, just because it's been so incoherent when it comes to its foreign policy.
Yeah. I think we're running out of time, but if I may, I'd like to pose a question to that both of you can answer. An organization like Massachusetts Peace Action calls for an end to militarism, and also the withdrawal of American troops from countries where they're not wanted, basically, like from everywhere. US get out of everywhere, which was the title of some paper that I read recently, which was very interesting. So I'd like to ask each of you for a statement on how you feel or you perceive the political situation in Iraq, civil society situation in Iraq, with respect to either the retention of American troops or the removal and withdrawal of American troops. What are the feelings there among the political elites? What is the feeling among civil society, and what might happen in Iraq should the American troops be forced to leave?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. Clearly Shamiran has identified many of the challenges that the new Prime Minister Al-Qadami is going to face, and his government is going to face. I personally, and most of the civil society activists I know in Iraq are hopeful that the militias that run are jeopardizing the security often in Iraq can be consolidated, can be brought under state control. They want an independent nation, and right now, it seems to me, and it seems to that U.S. troops are contributing to just huge uncertainty in Iraq. I think more than that, as Shamiran was saying, the irrationality and the lack of coherence in the Trump policy has really created many regional problems, and the growing Turkish bombing in Iraqi Kurdistan. And the fact that Turkey recently moved 5,000 troops across the Turkish border into Kurdistan is a sign of what Donald Trump enabled by saying, you know, actually, Turkey, you can go do what you want in Syria. And so now they're facing that. As a final thing, I just want to say, I'm going to put a bunch of resources into the chat box for people who are interested in any of the topics I've talked about, and also possibilities for greater solidarity with civil society.
Thank you so much, Terry. Shamiran, do you want to say anything about the U.S. troops and feelings there?
I think that's such a multifaceted question. We have to think about how the American public feels about these troop deployments, and we're constantly seeing, you know, since Iraq and Afghanistan, we're seeing less and less support for American engagement militarily abroad amongst, you know, American citizens in general, and sometimes they overlap along party lines. So there's a positive step that's happening in the U.S. in the way Americans are perceiving these kind of foreign policy blunders, right? And in many ways they are. On the other hand, in Iraq, you have right conditions, you know, amongst civil society organizations and Iraqi citizens overwhelmingly calling for, you know, Americans to leave. There was a resolution that was passed by the Iraqi parliament calling for American forces to leave, but that resolution was not supported by Sunni political factions, and it was not supported by Kurdish political factions. And much of that calculation was that what would happen if Americans are to leave, and what would happen to those particular communities in the way of safeguarding against the, you know, the Shia militias that are, you know, part and parcel now of the security sectors of the state. And so that question is an important one. It's got multiple, you know, dimensions. Again, on the ground, there's conditions. We're seeing conditions for calling for Americans to withdraw, and kind of for Iraqis to reinstate their sovereignty. And at the same time, there's also, I think, an economic dimension to the question of Iraqi sovereignty that we often, I think, don't think about. And so if people recall in 2019, Trump threatened to basically, I think it was 2019, I can't remember, there's so many threats, but that basically we were going to withhold Iraqi oil.
Oh yeah, this year, yeah.
And it was this year, okay. And that's no accident, right? When the state was being built from the ground up, there was a UN Security Council or UN resolution that created what's called the Iraqi State Oil Marketing Organization. And through UN Security Council resolution, I think it was 1483 or 84, that basically made the Federal Reserve's Bank of New York the main depositing hub for the sale of Iraqi oil. And so even when we think about Iraqi sovereignty, now the money of the sales of Iraqi oil goes to the Federal Reserve's Bank of New York. You know, it's called the Development Fund for Iraq, and Iraq controls about 95% of those funds, then they're deposited to the Iraqi National Bank. But at the same time, you know, if we think about sovereignty and questions of sovereignty, that threat can be real, right? In terms of how the lack of ability of the Iraqi at least to actually control directly the sales of their resources. So the question of sovereignty is really, really important, and it's, you know, it's a question that's being brought up by the protesters time and time again.
Wow, that's really interesting. Well, I'd like to thank you both very much for these really stimulating and important and valuable discussions on your part. We've learned a great deal about the political situation in Iraq and the region. We have learned a great deal about civil society initiatives in Iraq and across borders. And we've learned really that it is a very complex situation, and obviously made even more so, of course, by the recent threats and such by the Trump administration. But I'd like to thank also the audience and the people who sent in their questions, and we had several chats as well. Please look out for Terry's material, which she will be making available to everybody. So without further ado, I will say thank you again to everybody. It was a pleasure listening to all of this. I think we've all learned a great deal, and all the best to you, and good night.